Welcome to Canonical. I'm James Shao, and I'm joined by my co-hosts, Iad Darris and Sam Spieler.
Hello.
Hey.
Hi, guys. So today we have a special guest with us, Jon Sealy, author and founder of Haywire Books, a publishing house based in Richmond, Virginia. Hi, Jon.
Hey there. How are you?
I'm doing well. What are you up to nowadays?
Well, so just as a quick introduction, so James and I went to grad school together, and so I live in Richmond, Virginia. I'm a freelance copywriter by day and write novels and have a publishing house kind of in my spare time. And right now, at the end of 2020, I'm just trying not to be too absorbed in the news of the election. And I have a novel coming out in January called The Merciful. And so I'm gearing up to do some promotions for that. And, you know, otherwise just living life, kind of like Binks bowling in our novel here, just living in the suburbs and enjoying the humdrum of the everyday.
Are you in the suburbs?
I am. Binks's life is very much on the same wavelength as mine is much of the time.
Be careful around cars.
That's right.
That was one of those moments in the novel where it really made me realize it's not talking about present day, where he got into a car accident and the other guy, I guess, just drove away and people just kind of looked and didn't do anything. And the black yard worker just kind of stood in a slack-jawed manner, right? Which, I don't know. I mean, I guess it's not like racist or anything, but it's just something I don't think people would depict nowadays.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, this novel's full of stuff that would not be couth today. It's definitely a book of its times, because I guess he wrote it in the 50s, so it's definitely got the 1950s mores.
Well, let me introduce what we're doing then. So today we are continuing our series on postmodern novels of the South with a discussion of Walker Percy's The Moviegoer. You can join our extended book club discussion on Reddit at Canonical Pod, and you can find us on social media at Canonical Pod. If you would like to support us and your local bookstore, you can use our bookshop.org link, which you can find in our episode description. If you click on the link, you'll go to our store page and you can find our book club books and lists of other books that we recommend. And we'll be talking spoilers here, so if you don't want the ending spoiled because you haven't finished it yet, check out our review, which was published last week. This is the last book in our series. Next week, we'll wrap up the series with an overall discussion of the 3 books that we read: A Confederacy of Dunces, Swamplandia, and this one, The Moviegoer, before we move on to our next series, Transhumanist Science Fiction. I guess I'll start with talking about the ending, because it's something we alluded to in the last episode. I struggled a bit with the turn to happiness at the end. It seemed rather contrived to me, given the great pains that Percy takes to establish Binks as a character filled with ennui, to then have him achieve contentment. So how do you guys categorize this change in attitude? Do you think it is a turn to happiness? And what do you think led to this kind of change?
I had problems with it too. The way I'm framing it in my head is not so much a turn toward happiness as much as a turn toward being open to happiness occurring. We're going to get into Kierkegaard a little later, but I think that factors into it. There's an openness to letting the everydayness exist and not fighting it. And I think that was more central to it than anything else, allowing things to take place rather than fighting them with his search.
I think that's part of it. I think in the beginning of the novel, Binks is very concerned with controlling his experience, and he wants to kind of micromanage his life. And I think he does leave himself open to chance at the end. He kind of resists applying his rationality and his worldview. And I think that in Percy's mind, at least, that openness allows him to have something better.
What do you think causes this change?
That's the thing I struggled with the most, because it seemed
Random?
not random, but forced on him from his aunt. It seemed like he just realized everything she said was true, and he didn't have any argument against it. So, like, he was shrugging his shoulders.
You thought it was his aunt? I thought in that conversation that he didn't respond to it at all. I thought it was Kate.
Well, I think it was a combination of them. I don't feel like he had fully accepted his responsibility for Kate until his aunt kind of put that on him and said, "This is on you."
My read on this book overall, so one of you already mentioned Kierkegaard, is this sort of stages of going from the aesthetic stage of life to the religious stage of life. And I'm not a Kierkegaard scholar by any stretch of the imagination, but I think that sort of helped frame where Binks is at the beginning of the novel, is kind of languishing in this aesthetic stage where he's got all the right stuff. He subscribes to Consumer Reports. His armpits never stink. He's just living life, going to the movies, flirting with his secretary. But he's also, in Kierkegaard's term, living in this state of despair because he's kind of disconnected from God. And this metaphor of the search and his aunt kind of kicking it off and saying, hey, go take care of Kate here, she's got some issues, pushes him into this sort of quest to move into the religious sphere. The ambiguity of the ending for me is, does he actually achieve that transcendence into the religious sphere? Has he accepted a kind of wisdom, and so now he's no longer plagued by despair and thoughts of the search? Or I also was thinking this morning, I was wondering if it was more like the end of 1984, where Winston comes to accept that he loves Big Brother. He's sort of, Big Brother has won. And there's this everydayness of life in this consumerist society just win over Binks in the end. I mean, is he achieving religious transcendence, or is he kind of accepting of his life in this consumer society? I think that Percy is pushing toward some kind of transcendence into the religious sphere, but I think it's a good open question.
Do you feel that change was earned?
Yeah, I'd say for me it was. So the last time I read this book was about 10 years ago. I'm 37 now, and I was 27 the last time I read the book. And it was on occasion of its 50th anniversary of publication. I was younger than Binks last time. Mm-hmm. I think I was married, but I had no children. I was kind of living more of a young man's life. Binks in the beginning made sense to me 10 years ago, but now Binks at the end makes more sense to me now. I've sort of succumbed to the slow slide in the suburbs. I've got kids, and I sort of see how that happens. I mean, after a while, you sort of lose your revolutionary instinct, and you sort of lose this idea that you have to find meaning in life. And at some point, you just come to accept that things are the way they are, and you do achieve something like that in middle age, where you kind of come to terms with the nature of reality to some degree.
Living a little less for yourself and a little more for those around you.
Sure, yeah, there's that. But also, I think it's hard to frame everything recording this today, outside of politics. But 15 years ago, I might have been much more inclined to go march in the streets for a cause I believed in, or to write letters to the editor, just like Binks, write letters to the editor. These days sort of just feel like it's pointless to write letters to the editor. And I can really identify with the moment in the novel where he visits the library and he says he goes to read the sort of left-wing publications. And he's like, oh, yes, good point. And then he reads the right-wing publications and says, oh, right on, good shot. And then he leaves just, with nothing resolved. And I am reading reality in those terms, where everything is hashed out by teams and truth is sort of the casualty of that. And coming to terms with that has framed my reading of the novel this year versus 10 years ago.
So, we're talking a lot about the end of the novel and about why Binks changes. And different from Jon, my reading kind of circles back to Kierkegaard and this idea of the leap of faith. Kierkegaard thinks that the leap of faith is what happens when people make the move from the ethical sphere or the ethical stage into the religious stage. And I read the end of the novel as the leap of faith. And the beginning of the novel is Binks following rules and following his own kind of way of understanding the rules. I don't know if he's the bohemian or anything like you were saying, out there marching in the streets, because he seems pretty comfortable with his middle-class existence. He seems very comfortable with his white male privilege and all of that and all of the things that come with it. But I think that he is, I guess you'd call him an anal retentive sort of guy. Like, he likes things just so, and he gives up on that. And I don't know if it's him giving up to his Aunt Emma, as somebody said earlier, or him just giving up to the world in general and just saying, whatever happens, happens. I think the beginning of the novel, to me, is more interesting than the end. Most of the people talking about this novel seem to riff on Percy's training as a medical doctor. And Percy had the idea of the novelist as a diagnostician of modern life. How far can we carry this metaphor? Because to me, it seems like a diagnosis is only valuable insofar as it can lead to correct treatment. And I'm not sure if the treatment that we see for Binks's particular malaise in this novel is appropriate.
Well, what do you think is the correct treatment here? Is it marriage?
I don't know if it's marriage so far as kind of just giving yourself over to things beyond your control. I think for Kierkegaard, the idea is that faith is fundamentally irrational, and that being irrational in the end is the type of humility that's required to move into the religious phase. That to me does not kind of jibe with my worldview and my sensibility.
I'm curious to dig in more on this idea of diagnosis and sort of the idea of does it need treatment. Chekhov, who's also a doctor, had this quote that I love. The job of the artist is not to solve the problem. The job of the artist is to state the problem correctly, which to me sounds like the idea of diagnosis versus solution or treatment. So I don't know if he is making an argument for a solution or treatment, but the diagnosis to me rings true in this sort of idea of living in this aesthetic sphere, which I think is why it rings so strongly with me today, because we all live in this sort of aesthetic sphere where the individual is being subsumed by advertising. In Binks's day, or in Percy's day, the self was defined by what kind of deodorant you wore, but now it's defined by what you retweet on Twitter or what you like on Facebook. The technology companies have sort of subsumed the media companies in defining the individual. And so some part of me really loves this novel because it does feel like the diagnosis is a call to arms for the individual self to break out of this sort of everydayness.
Well, that much is true. I agree with you, but I think that Percy does offer something specific, because the Binks at the end of the novel seems to be healthier or happier or better in some way than the Binks at the beginning, don't you think? And the things that prompt that sort of change, to me, seem to be not something that I could endorse personally. I'm not so sure that matters. I mean, I disagree with the ideals, but I don't know if it's important to my evaluation of the novel or not.
Yeah, I guess that's what I was asking earlier about the end of 1984, where Winston has kind of come to love Big Brother, because in that sense, Orwell doesn't follow that novel, beyond that final sentence, but it does kind of, I don't know, suggest to me maybe this character, in coming to accept and embrace the reality of Big Brother in the world that he's living in, might be more psychologically healthy, because he's no longer plagued by a disconnect between the world as he understands it and the world that he is being presented, like saying, hey, we're at war this morning and we're not at war this afternoon. Oh, tomorrow morning we are at war again. My read on, and I know this isn't a discussion of Orwell, but my read on that is, it's clearly fraudulence being, propagated to the populace, and Winston is, as the individual self, is reacting against that. But then in the end, he seems like he's just sort of embraced it. And I guess my question is, at the end, is Percy's treatment or solution to just embrace it, or does he achieve some kind of way of transcending it and achieve a kind of peace with it?
There does seem to be a peace, but I don't know that it's acceptance fully, which sounds a little like they're at odds with each other, I guess. But it seems to me, even though there's a jump in time, it does seem to me that he is allowing things to happen, allowing things to unfold in his life, and pushing himself to do the things he said he would do with Kate, tell her how to do things and operate in her life in order that they can both be happy. But I don't know that it's a full acceptance, only because, not because he's fighting it, but because it just happens. It goes from him not being in that state to being in that state. We don't really see the transition per se.
Mm-hmm.
There are hints at change early on, but they don't seem to be changes within him. They're changes outside of him.
So this Kierkegaardian aspect that we've been talking about is pretty much the biggest thing in commentary on this novel. And even Percy himself said as much in a 1971 interview. He said, yes, this is what I had in mind when writing the novel. But strictly speaking, this context is not in the novel itself. So if we disagree with this particular treatment for modern malaise that we see at the end of the novel, and we resist this interpretation, is there enough left in the novel otherwise to recommend the novel, besides this added context that Kierkegaard adds to the novel?
So you mean if we have no understanding of Kierkegaard, can we still appreciate the novel as fully? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, think about when we were talking about John William Stoner, you had brought up the article by Ivor Winters, and you asked in that episode, does the reader need to know about William's relationship with Ivor Winters in order to enjoy this novel? And in that episode, I remember my answer was clearly no.
Mm-hmm.
That understanding enriches the enjoyment of the novel, but it's not necessary. Is understanding Kierkegaard necessary for understanding and enjoying the moviegoer?
I would argue that those are two separate questions, because I don't think it's necessary for enjoying the novel. I think it is necessary for full appreciation and for understanding what Percy is trying to do. I didn't know any of that going into this, and I enjoyed it, but it felt very surface level to me, the things that were happening. There didn't seem to be much of a reason for his change. And now that I've read a tiny bit of Kierkegaard and understand that aspect here, it makes a lot more sense, even though I still am unsure about how I feel about that change that happens to Binks. It makes sense in the logic of the novel now.
I had a similar experience as you, Sam, in that I didn't know that this novel was so closely tied to Kierkegaard, or that Percy was, rather. But when I read the novel, when we talked about this last time, I didn't enjoy it that much. It's not that I didn't like it, but I didn't find it very interesting. I think after the fact and learning about his connection to Kierkegaard, it did make it more interesting because I can engage with it on a different level, like you said. So without it, I think it really depends on how much you are invested or how much you want to learn about this person, Binks, and his life.
Would you recommend, any of you, would you recommend reading Kierkegaard, or at least some ideas before reading this? Because that seems to me like a kind of silly homework assignment, but reading up on Kierkegaard afterward is fine, but then you don't appreciate it the same way while you're reading The Moviegoer.
Yeah, I'm with Ed in that I think novels should stand alone. I don't think one should be required to read extra reading in order to appreciate it.
I don't mind intertextuality, and I don't mind connecting novels to ideas outside of the novel. But to me, I think that there has to be some recognition on the author's part of the act of reading as an emotional or intellectual experience that's bound in time. And that time that you're reading before you get to the Kierkegaard, if you get to the Kierkegaard later, still has to be considered. You can't just say, well, it doesn't matter how the reader feels about the novel because he'll feel differently when he gets to the Kierkegaard later on. That to me is not good enough.
I think you can probably understand the book without having any background on that stuff. I mean, and so one book that I had read before knowing anything about Kierkegaard was Richard Ford's The Sports Writer. And then actually also Peter Taylor's novel, A Summons to Memphis, which are both kind of heavily synced to this one. And I don't know if A Summons to Memphis might have predated this, but the Sports Writer came out 20 or 30 years later. And they both have some of the same kind of themes. And I think to me, it seems like one of those things where if you are interested in this kind of personal quest and a person looking up and trying to assess their relationship with some kind of higher power, I think this book offers a lot, even if you don't know the nomenclature of aesthetic sphere, religious sphere. You don't necessarily have to know Kierkegaard's theory about crop rotations to pick up on what Percy's putting down, but it's kind of hard for me to imagine, okay, well, let me give this book to somebody who doesn't know anything about this stuff. Would they like it? I don't know. I mean, I think sentence by sentence is kind of a funny novel. I mean, there are some amusements in the book that I think would offer somebody some pleasure in reading it without, having the philosophical background.
Ed, would you recommend this to people without Kierkegaard, without any knowledge?
It's very tough because the act of recommending a book nowadays has changed so much in our world of hypertext. I think that when you approach a new novel or a new work of culture, it's so instantly laden with all of the intertextual references that there isn't really that moment of uncertainty. Like, you can avoid it if you make an effort to avoid it, but if you went, for example, on Amazon and you just looked at some of the reviews, I'm sure you'd find the word Kierkegaard in the first few reviews. Like, everywhere you look, people are talking, and we're just so full of conversations now that it's very difficult to avoid the connections that things have. All that said, if somebody didn't know about Kierkegaard, and I didn't think that they would find out about Kierkegaard before they finished reading this book, I don't know if I would recommend it. Like Jon, I do think that the writing is playful and it's fun, and he's got a good prose style, but I do think that the plot is seriously crippled because without that kind of understanding of these spheres and stages of life, I just feel like the novel is underwhelming, not language-wise, but plot-wise.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that plot and how it's presented to us. Binks seems to me like he's pretty unreliable as a narrator, or at least he is unable to accurately comment on his own changes or outlook. He gives us one view, but I think the truth in the narrative, the things you are meant or at least encouraged to understand, are the things that are not said directly by him, or at least the things that are not running in his interior monologue. I think the things happening around him tell us more about his inner turmoil and evolution than he does directly, though he does give us some tools that we can use to diagnose how he feels. His searching leads to more problems and despair than it answers, and I think by giving up the search, that's what allows him to find what I assume is peace, or at least the allowance of the good of everydayness to enter into his life. So certification, repetition, and rotation, I'll define those as best I understand them briefly. Certification, as far as I understand it, is the understanding of the self through a signifier. So in the book, Binks applies it mostly to the movies he's watching. If a movie takes place in his neighborhood, it certifies his neighborhood as a good, interesting place in which he exists. It solidifies his meaning and his existence. Repetition is a nearly identical experience to one in the past that nullifies the everydayness that happens in between those two experiences. And then rotation, a current experience, anticipates future positive ones. So these all are defined in terms of movies for Binks, but I think the movies are a distraction for him. I don't think he gets what he's meant to get from the movies. For example, Kate, when he's watching a movie with him, there's a scene, I think, that takes place in Gentilly where he lives. And she acknowledges that, and she knows his terms. She asks him if he feels certified, and he says yes. But I think that's less important than the fact that she is certifying him and certifying that moment. The same thing happens with repetition. He talks about that in terms of movies, but I think that is less important than the seriousness, the gravity of him getting in a car accident and surviving and being relatively unharmed when he's with Sharon. But it calls to the reader's mind the earlier accident that Kate describes, which kind of ruined her life, even though she said the moment after it, when she took the bus home, was the happiest moment in her life. If we take her at her word, even though that's not Binks's word, if we take her at her word, that's a pretty sad thing. And to not give that bigger weight, I think, is a waste. And the same thing with rotation. That was a little bit harder for me to pick out in the novel. And I think there are more instances than this, but at the end of the novel, he tells Kate to pick up the important paperwork downtown and tells her just how to do the errand successfully without anything bad happening to her. And he seems like he's happy to do that. And he's surrounded by family who love him. And I see that as rotation because he's finally allowing for the groundwork to happen in order for that happiness to be received, in order for his happiness to arrive rather than forcing it to happen through other means. Am I reading too much into these exercises? I don't think so, but I also don't know if I'm right in my use of them.
Well, it makes sense to me. That term rotation was his term for life in the aesthetic sphere, right? Compares it to crop rotations and says, just like you want to rotate your crops to a more fertile field year by year so that you can allow the soil to replenish. You want to, if you're in the aesthetic sphere, rotate your activities so that you don't get bored, right? So if you go to the same theater every Friday night and go to the same movie, you get bored. Unfortunately, in Kierkegaard's vision, living a life of rotations eventually leads to despair because you can't outrace the boredom of what you're doing in the life you're living. So I guess the question is he in yet one more rotation at the end of the novel? Meaning, is he still back in the aesthetic sphere and just found himself a nice new rotation that is keeping him temporarily occupied and he will eventually find despair in the future? Or has he somehow transcended this world of rotations and going from secretary to secretary and theater to theater? And is he transcended, or has he just rotated to another space?
What Percy, I think, wants us to believe is that this isn't just another rotation, that he has broken the cycle. But I don't know, based on the things we've already talked about, I don't know that we can answer that for sure. I don't know that the ending is earned in the way it should be in a non-philosophical novel.
Do you think you can read the image of the black man driving up to church as a symbol of progress? That he seems to be hinting toward that this is not another rotation?
Well, this is something significant, I think, that we haven't touched on at all. I think it's very important that it happens on Ash Wednesday, which is the typical day of atonement at the beginning of Lent. I think that it's significant to Percy's own Catholic worldview and the worldview that I think Kierkegaard is pointing to with all of these ideas of different stages leading up to the religious stage.
Well, and that the whole book takes place during Mardi Gras. That's kind of a time of excess and celebration before atonement.
I would have to say that I don't really understand your reading of rotation there at the end of the novel with him talking to Kate. I think the rotation was more him traveling to these different movie theaters and fixating on these different stars and talking to the owners of the theaters. That to me was a symbol. It was emblematic of the aesthetic stage and the fixation on these divertments. And at the end of the novel, him with Kate, it was something different.
Yeah, I think that's his application of it, he being Binks. But I saw that as also unreliable for the narration for two reasons, I guess. He talks about the reason he does that is that it elevates him above just being an observer. He has a greater appreciation for the movies. He seems to think that this is a much better way of interacting with the movie and the experience, but it still just relegates him to being an observer, even if he doesn't think he is. He doesn't take any action.
Yeah.
He's just simply watching what's on screen, and it's reflecting his own life as an observer.
Okay, let's stop here and take a break. We'll be right back. Welcome back. So we are reading this book as part of our series of postmodern novels from the South. What do you think makes this novel postmodern?
For me, I think that the novel isn't postmodern in form, which is the way that we often talk about fiction, but it's postmodern in sentiment only because it seems like it's one of the first novels that I can think of that really acknowledges how our experience is mediated by the media. And we see that in Binks with the way that he understands himself and his place in the world through these movies that he constantly watches. That to me is really central to the postmodern experience, is the mediated experience of life.
The unreliability of Binks as a narrator that I mentioned earlier also is not a hallmark of all postmodern works, but it certainly is a hallmark of a lot of them. I think that is central to my understanding of this as a postmodern novel.
I actually think it reads very modernist to me. I think if you take out the movies, which I know you can't really do because it's called The Moviegoer and he's always watching movies. But I think if you take out the movies and it's just about ennui, it feels very modernist. It feels like something someone could have written in the 20s. Someone who's coming back from a war, not finding much meaning in life. So to me, it very much blends the two periods.
I understand that, but I think his reaction and the way he talks about that on ennui feels much more post-World War II than post-World War I.
The distinction between modern, postmodern, and if we're in a postmodern period now, it seems more like framing to me, like a useful framing for talking about a generalized period, rather than like distinct philosophical beliefs. The way I understand postmodernism is whereas modernism was kind of expressing some dissatisfaction with the nature of reality, postmodernism kind of takes an axe to it. The idea of the thing and the thing itself are not even related at all. But, I don't really know how to apply something like that to this book. To you guys who are not in the South, does the South still hold as a particular entity, and does that affect your reading of this book?
It does in terms of framing when this was written, but that South has, I think, permanently changed, and the South of Walker Percy doesn't exist anymore. So reading this definitely feels like I'm looking into a crystal ball and looking into the past.
Yeah, there's two kinds of distancing that's happening here, and I remarked on this last episode. The first is time, because the way that he uses his position of power to date his secretaries, I think would definitely raise red flags nowadays if a writer wrote that. And as someone reading it now, that, it kind of took me out of the novel because I started thinking about that. And I also remarked in the review episode that I couldn't really relate to this character, actually. I didn't find that I had much in common with him. So part of that's time, but the other part of it is, I think, because I'm not from the South and I'm not privy to that kind of cultural construct, that kind of belonging.
Yeah, I mean, you never expect to read a novel from 1961 and forget that it's from 1961. It didn't bother me. I think that context it's meaningful, but it's not something to get hung up on because, everything ages, everything passes. So
fun discussion to have, aging and passing.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
All right, let's conclude here then. Thank you for listening. Thank you, Jon, for coming on. Where can people find your work?
Well, so the publishing house is Haywire Books, and it's just, haywirebooks.com. Books are for sale, wherever you buy books.
And what's your new book that's coming out
Yeah,
soon?
so the new novel is called Merciful, and it is maybe a Southern novel. It's set in Low Country, South Carolina, and is about the hit and run killing of a bicyclist and the subsequent trial of the guy that did it. It doesn't have an epigraph from Kierkegaard, but I almost stuck in his no joke. I almost stuck in his quote, "Subjectivity is truth," as the epigraph, because it kind of does follow 4 different sets of characters, and each one present a different reality on what happened. And from these sort of different angles, you kind of come to have some sense of what happened, but the whole thing is filtered through a narrator. And it's a very conscious narrator, so the whole thing is kind of inside the narrative's brain, so it sort of pulls you outside the frame a little bit. So it kind of is fitting for a discussion on the moviegoer in a lot of ways. So this was fun. So I appreciate you guys inviting me to participate.
Yeah, kind of like a Rashomon.
Yes,
to bring movies back into it.
When is this book coming out?
January 19th, so a couple months.
Great. Well, thank you for coming on. I'm speaking for everyone here, but I think we'd love to have you on again whenever you can find time from your very busy schedule.
Thank you.
Yeah, definitely.
And of course, you can find us on Reddit at Canonical Pod, where we post threads for our book club discussion every Wednesday. So you'll find a thread for this discussion as well. And you can also find us on social media at Canonical Pod. And as Jon mentioned before, we are on bookshop.org, and you can use that bookshop.org link to find Jon's book, which we will have in a list. Next week, we'll wrap up the series. Till next time, happy reading. We'll talk to you soon.